My name is Gary Webb. I am an investigative journalist. I've been an investigative journalist for about 25 years for daily newspapers. And in 1996, I wrote a series of stories entitled Dark Alliance, which was about CIA involvement in drug trafficking. My story showed was that the cocaine that was being sold in those neighborhoods was coming from mainly one source, and this one source was being used to finance a guerrilla war in Central America. And we had gotten it out in a big way that they couldn't control, and that was through the internet.
And then they shot him twice in the head, and they undoubtedly murdered him.
On the evening of December 9th, 2004, an award-winning journalist named Gary Webb, who had become infamous for alleging that the CIA had been, in part, responsible for the crack epidemic ravaging American cities, was alone in his Sacramento home. Once a rising star in the world of journalism, Gary had now become a pariah with a ruined reputation and low to no job prospects. Before it was time to leave, Gary would type out 4 lengthy notes and mail them out to his close family members. This would be his last contribution to the art of writing. He would place a cremation certificate and his social security card on the kitchen counter, and leave the keys to his car and motorcycle in an envelope for his son to find. He would neatly package his numerous journalist awards, from his Journalist of the Year award that he received in 1996, to his Pulitzer Prize that he received in 1990 for his coverage of the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake, which had ravaged the Santa Cruz and Bay Area. These awards were neatly stacked into boxes and placed in the corner of the living room. On his front door, he would post a note that read, "Please do not enter. Call 911 for assistance. Thank you." After this, Gary Webb walked into his bedroom for the last time. He put his driver's license on the bed next to him and grabbed an old .38 caliber revolver and placed it near his right ear. The bullet went through the back of his right cheek and out his left. The shot wasn't fatal. He squeezed the trigger again, and this time he hit an artery. Gary's body was found the next day. At the age of 49, Gary Webb was gone with 2 bullet wounds to the head. In the time since, a plethora of conspiracy theories have arisen on the internet to explain the demise of Gary Webb. The question that has haunted many to this day is why? Why did Gary perish? Was he truly depressed enough to shoot himself twice in the head? Or was Gary finished off by someone else? Perhaps the CIA. In 1996, Gary Webb, working for the San Jose Mercury News, released 3 online news articles titled Dark Alliance, from August 18th to August 20th, 1996. In these articles, Gary Webb alleged that CIA-backed guerrilla armies in Latin America, collectively called the Contras, had opened the first pipeline between Colombia's cocaine cartels and the black neighborhoods of Los Angeles. As a result, Webb would claim that the Contras were able to funnel tons of cocaine to the United States and take out millions in drug profits out to Nicaragua, where they could then use those funds to fight and hopefully overthrow its socialist Sandinista government. Webb would allege that this pipeline was established and headed by 2 Nicaraguans, Daniela Baladon and Norwin Menendez, who according to him had connections with the Contras and the CIA. Gary would further claim that these 2 worked with a local LA dealer named Rick Ross. Together, these 3 would kickstart the crack epidemic in the United States. While all of this was going on, the CIA, which had been training and funding the Contras in Nicaragua since 1980, was fully aware of these nefarious activities and either turned a blind eye or, in some cases, provided legal protection to this Nicaraguan ring by pressuring US federal authorities not to prosecute those involved. After Webb published these articles, he would very quickly come under attack by other newspapers, specifically the New York Times, the LA Times, and the Washington Post, who would pick apart Webb's story and discredit him. Webb's own newspaper would disown the story under all the pressure, and Webb would eventually resign from Mercury News in 1997 and quickly watch his journalistic career disappear before his eyes. Due to Webb's history of challenging the US government and making extraordinary claims of CIA's corruption, many today have come to believe that Gary Webb was systematically targeted by mainstream news and eventually killed by the CIA to silence him, and ensure that his reporting would not jeopardize the plans of those in high places. In this video, I'm going to cover who Gary Webb was, his reporting on the ties between the CIA and the crack epidemic, and whether his claims have any substance, and ultimately, whether the CIA had any involvement in his death. This video is going to be a little bit long, but trust me, all this context that I provide is essential to fully understand the situation. Also, I wish to give you enough information to reach your own conclusions. After all, you shouldn't just take my word for it. I mean, I'm just some random dude on the internet. Now, with all that out of the way, let's get started. To begin this story, we first need to go back to the beginning to see where Webb started, and how he ended up with 2 bullets in his head.
first, and then we'll talk about the issues.
It was about a cocaine ring that operated along the west coast of the United States throughout most of the 80s. And they were funneling, they were selling cocaine in South Central. They were also selling it in Oakland. They were selling it in San Francisco. They were selling it in San Jose. And some of the money they were making was going to support an army that the men who ran the cocaine ring worked for, called the FDN. This was an army that the CIA started in 1981 and supported.
Better known to us, most of us who remember news, the Contras.
Who was Gary Webb? Gary Webb was born on August 31st, 1955 in Corona, California. The son of a Marine, Webb and his family constantly moved around the country, eventually settling in Indianapolis. From a very young age, Gary wanted to be a journalist. Writing, uncovering mysteries, and exposing the truth were his passions. He would first get his chance at journalism when he joined a school newspaper at the Indianapolis Community College. He would later transfer to Northern Kentucky University and begin writing for their school newspaper as well. However, Webb dropped out in 1978 when he secured his first professional journalist job at the Kentucky Post. He would soon jump over to the Cincinnati Post, where he would, in 1980, write his first breakthrough story, called The Coal Connection, in which he uncovered how the murder of a coal company president was tied to local organized crime. This story would lead to Gary winning his first major accolade, the National Investigative Reporters and Editors Award. However, Webb's success and obsession with uncovering the dark truths wouldn't stop here, because 5 years later in 1985, Gary published a new investigative series called Doctoring the Truth, in which he exposed problems in the Ohio State Medical Board. His news reporting eventually led to an Ohio State House investigation, and ultimately changes to the Ohio Medical Practice Act. Once again, Webb had proven himself as a journalist and as someone who was willing to challenge those in power and expose corruption and malpractice in the government. However, it wasn't always smooth sailing for Webb. In 1986, Webb was sued by the Chief Justice of the Ohio Supreme Court, Frank D. Celebrezze. Webb had alleged that the judge had been taking bribes from organized criminal groups. In response, Celebrezze would successfully sue Webb's employer at the time, the Plain Dealer, which was based out of Cleveland. But this hiccup would do little to stunt Webb's career, because in 1988, Webb would be hired by the San Jose Mercury News. This is where Webb would both reach his peak and ultimately face his downfall. In 1989, the Loma Prieta earthquake hit western central California, around the Santa Cruz and Bay Area, causing massive devastation and loss of life. Webb, based in the Bay Area, would play a pivotal role in covering the events. As a result of this reporting, he won the Pulitzer Prize for general news reporting in 1990. At this point, Webb was a rising star, and the future seemed limitless. But just a short 6 years later, Webb, like Icarus, would fly too close to the sun and fall to his death, both figuratively and literally. In 1996, Webb wouldn't just challenge some local CEO or some two-bit gangster, or even a Supreme Court judge. No. Now Webb would go after those at the top. For Webb would claim that he had found a grand conspiracy hidden in the darkness, a conspiracy that involved one of the most powerful agencies in America, the Central Intelligence Agency, or the CIA for short. In the 1980s and 90s, cocaine was ripping through American cities like a wildfire. Many of you have probably learned about this through movies such as Scarface or TV shows like Narcos. Now the process was quite simple. A special plant called coca was grown in South American countries like Colombia and Bolivia. It was prepared into a white powdery substance called cocaine and then shipped north by a complex network of cartels to the United States, where the largest and wealthiest client base resided. But the problem with cocaine was that it was a rich man's drug. Not only that, but you needed a decent amount of it to actually get high. Perfect for selling to businessmen or professionals like lawyers and doctors. But the problem is that most of the population was either middle or working class. To expand the customer base, prices would have to come down. One of the great things about capitalism is that it breeds innovation, and that innovation would come in the form of crack cocaine, a solidified crystal form of cocaine that was smoked instead of snorted, and offered a more intense high at a lower dosage. The price per kilo was dramatically lower than cocaine. Before you knew it, cocaine had finally become a poor man's drug, the opioid of the masses. As a result, it would rip through poor, largely black neighborhoods across America, especially in cities such as Los Angeles. It is the City of Angels where Gary Webb would focus his story. This story would come in 3 separate parts that together form the Dark Alliance series. Now this series wouldn't just be impactful because of its content, but also because of its format. The series was published online on the new and burgeoning internet. It featured hyperlinks that could be clicked, and readers would be led to other pages that contained additional material, like pictures, biographies of the characters involved, audio recordings as well. As a result, this story would be one of the first to go viral on the internet. While many believe that the crack epidemic had been fueled solely by cartels in Colombia, Gary Webb would offer an alternative explanation. he would claim that the crack epidemic was actually started not by the Colombians themselves, but instead by a group of middlemen from a mostly obscure Central American country, with the unofficial blessings of the CIA. According to a New York Times article titled "Resurrecting a Disgraced Reporter" by David Carr, Webb had first come across the idea of CIA involvement when he was approached by the girlfriend of a drug dealer who was on trial. The woman had claimed that her boyfriend had connections to the CIA. She had somehow managed to present him with enough evidence to get him to believe that some of the drugs arriving in America were brought in by Nicaraguans, who themselves had the unofficial approval from the federal government in the name of national security.
A young lady in Oakland had read one of them and called me up and put me onto a story about her boyfriend, who was an accused cocaine trafficker who had that happen to him. He had his property taken away.
Danilo Blandon?
His name was Rafael Cornejo. It turned out that the key witness against him for the federal government was this fellow Danilo Blandon, who had been a leader of the Contras in California in the early 1980s and had been a huge cocaine trafficker in his own right. And when I got into investigating her boyfriend's case, I came across Blandon, and I came across his involvement with the Contras and his involvement ultimately with a major crack wholesaler in Los Angeles named Freeway Ricky Ross. And so I did a series that said that the crack market in South Central Los Angeles had been created in the early 1980s with the help of this Contra drug ring.
Now remember, everything that I discuss in this section is from Webb's articles, unless otherwise stated. I'm going to tell the story the way Webb presented it. Afterwards, in the next section, I'll analyze it and let you know what I believe to be true and untrue based upon my own research. So let's get started. According to Webb, to learn the truth of how crack ended up in black American neighborhoods, you first needed to go back to 1979, to the south, to the city of Managua, Nicaragua. In 1979, Nicaragua was ruled by an American-backed dictator known as Anastasio Somoza, something that wasn't unique in Latin America. The US had already supported dictatorships in Guatemala, Chile, and Brazil, and in a few years would support the infamous Manuel Noriega in Panama. However, the winds of revolution would arrive in the summer of 1979, when the Sandinistas, a group of left-wing socialists, would sweep into power. Supporters of the old regime would flee the country for their own survival. Two of these exiles important for our story are Danilo Blandon and Norwin Menendez. Blandon was born to a wealthy slumlord father and had attended multiple private schools across Latin America, and eventually gained a master's degree in marketing. Right before his exile, he had been serving as a director of wholesale markets under the Somoza regime. He had been responsible for managing around $27 million in US foreign aid that Nicaragua had received to help improve its agricultural systems. The other major exile, and the main leader of this conspiracy according to Webb, would be Norwin Menendez. Menendez and his family had strong ties to the Somoza government. His brothers Armando and Fermin had been generals in the Nicaraguan army, and Armando would also go to serve as the commander of the Managua police, and Armando would eventually be gunned out in 1978 by a group opposed to the Somoza regime. While his family had direct involvement in the government, Menendez himself would become involved in the criminal world instead, from an early age. As early as 1972, Menendez had already been involved in drug trafficking, and in the mid-1970s had been running a stolen car ring, allegedly for the benefit of officials in the Somoza regime. The most significant accusation against him before Webb wrote his story was that he was accused of hiring an assassin to kill the Nicaraguan chief of customs. This killing may have been linked to the stolen car ring. Regardless of what crime he committed, he was always cleared of wrongdoing by the same police force that his brother ran. In 1979, after the revolution, both Blandon and Menendez would gain entry into the United States as political refugees. By 1981, Blandon would find himself working as a used car salesman in East Los Angeles, quite a downgrade from his former occupation. However, Blandon wasn't content with his new lot in life, and according to Webb, had been working with other exiles to build a rebel army and retake his country. This army would eventually come to be known as the Contras, a group of right-wing militias that opposed the new left-wing Sandinista government and engaged in an insurgency to overthrow it. However, the rallies and drive for donations just weren't working. It appeared that local support just wasn't there. A new opportunity for raising money would be needed. For Blandon, this new opportunity would soon reveal itself. He would receive a phone call from an old college friend named Donald Barrios. Barrios asked Blandon to pick up Norwin Menendez from the airport. Upon meeting each other, Menendez would tell Blandon that they would earn money by selling cocaine imported from Colombia and send the money to Honduras, where it would then be funneled into Nicaragua. Menendez would also tell Blandon that they first needed to fly to Honduras to meet a man named Colonel Enrique Bermudez. Enrique had previously been a colonel in Somoza's army, but after the Somoza's government was overthrown, he would flee to Honduras. Afterwards, in August of 1981, Enrique would found the Nicaraguan Democratic Front. This would become the most powerful of all the Contra groups, Enrique had also formed strong ties with the CIA, and his forces would receive funding and training from the intelligence agency. In fact, Enrique himself would be directly on the CIA's payroll. However, the money provided by the CIA would prove insufficient, and Enrique needed to look for other sources of funding. This is where Menendez and Blandon would come into the picture. Webb alleged that after this meeting, Menendez and Blandon decided to help Enrique to start raising money for the Contras by selling cocaine in the United States. Though Blandon would claim that Enrique was unaware that they were selling cocaine, Webb would allege that the Contras leadership was fully aware, especially as Menendez had a well-known connection to the drug trade, and as a result, everyone would have been aware that any money raised by Menendez would at least in part come from drugs. According to Webb, both Blandon and Menendez were now working for the CIA's army. Heading back to the United States, Menendez from his base in San Francisco would oversee the importation of thousands of kilos of cocaine into the United States, and the funneling of millions of dollars in profits to the CIA-backed Contras back in Central America. The entire operation would officially commence in 1982, with Menendez staying in San Francisco to oversee the entire operation, and his second-in-command, Blandon, going to Los Angeles to oversee local distribution. Los Angeles would become one of the biggest markets for drugs in the entire world. Menendez would give Blandon a crash course on the drug trade over 2 days in San Francisco, kind of like when you have to jam as much information as possible for your college finals. What is interesting is that Webb would note the following in his article. Menendez declined to discuss any cocaine dealings that he may have had, other than to deny that he ever transferred benefits to his business to the FDN. Business is business. Regardless, according to Webb, Blandon traveled back to LA with a one-way plane ticket, 2 kilograms of cocaine, and the names of 2 customers. However, Blandon would soon encounter some trouble trying to offload his supply. The problem was that his product was too expensive for the average customer. According to the DEA, cocaine at this time was selling for upwards of $5,200 an ounce. Blandon, being the marketing graduate that he was, would decide to change markets. Instead of targeting the rich, he would now target the poor LA black neighborhoods. But how to sell white gold to the poor? Well, worry not, because there will soon be a solution. When Blandon started to deal cocaine in Los Angeles, crack cocaine was starting to hit the streets. Crack was a solidified version of cocaine that was smoked through the mouth instead of snorted through the nose. Smokers could get a harder, quicker, and cheaper hit than they could get with cocaine. You didn't need thousands of dollars anymore, just 20 would do. And before you knew it, crack was ravaging through the poorest neighborhoods in South Central Los Angeles. But Blandon wouldn't deal the crack himself. Instead, he would find his own apprentice, a young man by the name of Ricky Darnell Ross, or Rick Freeway Ross, as he would become more infamously known as. Ross had been a talented tennis player who wanted to achieve a college scholarship, but his lack of literacy prevented any academic adventures. Instead, he would drop out of high school and attend a trade school, but the 9-to-5 grind just wouldn't do. He wanted more and he wanted it fast, so he would turn to the lucrative world of crime. In 1979, Ross was arrested for stealing a car, but he decided to abandon the trade after his arrest. Adrift and poor, Ross needed an opportunity to make money. Fortunately for him, that opportunity would soon come from his friend one Christmas season. His friend would introduce him to cocaine and tell him that this was going to be the next best thing. After the sales pitch, Ross would, through one of his college teachers, believe it or not, meet a Nicaraguan dealer named Henry Corrales. Corrales would agree to supply Rick Ross with small amounts of relatively cheap cocaine. Through his connections with the various Crip gangs, Ross would build up a loyal customer base. Eventually, Corrales would introduce Rick Ross to Blandon himself. This is where the operation would really get started, and Ross would now find himself part of a supply chain that he had previously believed to be unimaginable. Starting in 1983, Menendez would supply Blandon, and Blandon would supply Ross with large and competitively priced wholesale cocaine. Ross would then cook the cocaine into crack and use his pre-existing infrastructure to push this new product. Webb would state that Ross was moving between $2 to $3 million worth of crack per day. Ross himself would mention that counting the money was his biggest problem. A Nicaraguan cocaine dealer, Jacinto Torres, would state that Blandon's cocaine business was exploding. Apparently in 1983 and 1984, Menendez, according to Torres, was flying 200 to 400 kilograms of cocaine from Miami to the West Coast for Blandon. He himself would soon sell it through Ross's vast infrastructure. In fact, Blandon would claim that he sold Ross up to 100 kilograms of cocaine a week. This was worth anywhere from $65 million to $130 million every single year. Webb himself would argue that Blandon was a Johnny Appleseed of crack in California, who would become the first direct line between the LA gangs and the cartels of Colombia, who supplied the cocaine. Webb would also argue that Blandon would go on to establish new crack markets all across the United States. In fact, Blandon would actually be caught on a wiretap admitting that he sold upwards of 2,000 to 4,000 kilos of cocaine over 10 years.
Probably these people have been working with me 10 years. I only got sold there about 2,000 or 4,000, I don't know. I don't remember how many.
All of this, according to Webb, was being done to support the Contras, who themselves had been formed, trained, and supported by the CIA. Again, for clarity, this is how the operation worked according to Webb. Menendez imported the cocaine, Blandon distributed it to domestic dealers like Ross, and Ross cooked the cocaine and turned it into crack and then sold it to the final customers through his connections with the various LA gangs like the Bloods and the Crips. Ross himself would credit his success to Blandon. Ross would state that Blandon was a reliable supplier who would offer him large amounts of cocaine at cheap prices. Webb in his article would allege that this was due to Blandon's connections with the Menendez and the CIA. Ross himself was apparently unaware of these connections. However, Webb would claim that Ross was becoming the main deal in LA, and this made him a prime target for the LAPD. Former LAPD detective and a member of the Freeway Rick Task Force, Steve Pollock, would state that Ross was one of the main dealers in the area. The task force itself had been established in 1987 to investigate and hopefully arrest Ross himself. After a major raid on Blandon's operations, both Blandon and Ross started to feel the heat. As a result, in 1987, both Ross and Blandon decided to end their profitable relationship and leave Los Angeles. Ross would go to Cincinnati and Blandon to Miami. During his self-exile, Blandon invested his drug profits into rental car and export businesses, sometimes in partnership with another Nicaraguan exile named Jose Estrada. Estrada, according to Webb, was involved with the CIA-backed Contras and had helped other Nicaraguan exiles obtain visas in the United States. Blandon would also apparently buy a steakhouse, which would become a popular spot for members and supporters of the Contras. However, both Ross and Blandon wouldn't stay quiet for long. Ross decided to open a new crack market in Cincinnati. Since crack wasn't widely available in the city, Ross would command much higher prices. But in 1988, Ross's second empire would quickly begin to crumble after one of his mules was caught by the police. Ross would plead guilty to crack trafficking charges, and in 1990 would be sentenced to 10 years in prison. Back in Miami, Blandon was soon seen as legitimate business properties fail one by one. After failing to go legit, Blandon would travel once again to San Francisco and begin dealing drugs again from 1990 to 1991. During this time, Blandon sold about 425 kilograms of cocaine for a value of $10.5 million. However, Webb would state in his article that the nature of Blandon's new operations was now different. Instead of selling for the Contras, Blandon was in it for himself, and as a result was now constantly harassed by the police. Webb implies that this was because the CIA was no longer providing him protection, as he had gone independent. Blandon would be arrested multiple times and eventually taken by the DEA in San Diego. He was charged with a conspiracy to distribute cocaine and found guilty. However, Blandon wouldn't face any lengthy prison sentences. Instead, he would become a DEA informant, where he would be paid $166,000 for assisting the government in its war against drugs by providing information and testifying during trials. For some context, $166,000 in the early 90s is over $390,000 today. Blandon had officially become a government asset. In fact, Blandon would even betray his old friend Ross on behalf of the government. Ross was still in prison when Blandon was released. However, Ross would take a similar deal to what Blandon had taken. In exchange for testifying against some LAPD officers on behalf of the Department of Justice, Ross would see his sentence reduced. It appears that members of the narcotics division of the LAPD had gotten into trouble for beating suspects, stealing drug money, and planting evidence. In fact, Steve Pollock himself was now a defendant. Ross would testify against him and in exchange received 5 years off his sentence and the ability to keep some of his drug profits. In 1994, Ross was paroled and released from prison. He would attempt to start a new life free from drugs, but these attempts would soon fail, because unfortunately for Ross, Blandon would soon re-enter his life. Blandon had approached Ross hoping for some help on financing a drug deal. Ross originally refused, but decided to help him after Blandon claimed to be in dire financial straits. Blandon wanted his help to setting up a deal to sell 100 kilograms of cocaine. On March 2, 1995 in San Diego, Ross arrived for the deal, but was soon surrounded by the police and eventually arrested after a short police chase. Ross was charged and Blandon would testify against him at his trial. And according to Webb, the Department of Justice obtained a court order that prevented Ross's lawyers from delving into Blandon's ties with the CIA. During the trial, Blandon would state, "Yes, now remember we were running just whatever we were running in LA, the profit goes to the Contra Revolution. I don't know."
So you were running this Los Angeles operation, isn't that correct?
Yes. But remember, we were running just whatever we were running in LA, the profit it was going to the Contra Revolution. I don't know in San Francisco.
Apparently, Blandon himself would receive $45,500 in payment for his role in the sting and trial, and would soon return to Nicaragua. Ross, on the other hand, was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without parole. But it wasn't just Blandon who managed to escape the hammer of justice, which was quite liberal in the 90s America. Apparently, Menendez himself never spent a day in a US prison. even though his drug activities had been known to the US government since at least 1974. Menendez's operations in San Francisco were well known to the DEA, and he had been the subject of 45 different investigations. Webb in his article would argue that the investigations were usually interfered with by different federal agencies across the US government. Webb would state that certain agencies such as the DEA, US Customs, and the LA County Sheriff's Department, and the California Bureau of Narcotic Enforcement had their own investigations interfered with by the CIA or other federal interests. Webb highlighted that in 1984, Menendez took a picture with a major Contra political leader named Adolfo Calero, who was apparently a longtime CIA operative. Furthermore, supporting Webb's claim that Menendez was linked with the CIA and received protection from US law enforcement. However, in 1989, the US government would finally indict Menendez with a conspiracy to distribute 1 kilo of cocaine in 1984. However, there would be no arrest and no conviction. Menendez would eventually leave the country and return to Nicaragua, like Blandon had done. The overall argument that Webb was making was that Menendez was linked to and protected by the CIA. This is why he remained free and untouched by both local, state, and federal law enforcement. Webb argued that the same for Blandon. On October 7, 1986, the FBI, IRS, local police, and the LA County Sheriff launched a joint operation to raid Blandon's properties across LA. However, the raid was a complete failure, and all of Blandon's properties had been cleared out before the police arrived. Ron Spear, the spokesman for the LA Sheriff's Department, would state that Blandon somehow knew that he was under surveillance, and had decided to preemptively protect himself by clearing out his safe houses. Webb would quote the LA Federal Public Defender Barbara O'Connor, who herself stated that the cops always knew that their investigations had been compromised by the CIA. The CIA, according to Webb, was protecting Blandon and Menendez from domestic agencies so that they could continue to sell crack and fund the Contras. However, Webb alleges that the government would turn on the drug dealers in the late 80s after Congress approved additional funding for the Contras, and the two dealers were no longer needed. Blandon himself stated that his sales were CIA approved for a time, according to Webb. His lawyer Brunin stated that Blandon never admitted to him that he was selling cocaine for the CIA, but he himself personally believed that he was involved. The connection between Menendez and the CIA gets more interesting in 1992, when Menendez was arrested in Nicaragua for drug trafficking. During his trial, another smuggler linked to Menendez named Enrique Miranda would testify against him. Miranda claimed that Menendez worked with a CIA asset in the Salvadorian Air Force named Marcos Aguado to fly cocaine from Colombia to a US Air Force base in Texas. After the trial was complete and Menendez was convicted, Miranda would soon go missing in 1995 and would never be seen again. And that, ladies and gentlemen, was the main essence of the 3 Dark Alliance articles that Webb published in 1996. To summarize, the main accusations that Webb presented are as follows. Menendez worked with a CIA agent and leader of one of the largest Contra groups, Enrique Bermudez, to sell cocaine and crack in the United States to fund the Contras' war against the socialist government of Nicaragua. Menendez used the Salvadorian military to fly cocaine from Colombia to the United States and then shipped it directly to Blandon. Blandon then distributed the cocaine to Freeway Rick Ross, who cooked it into crack and distributed it to customers through his connections with local LA gangs. This Contra drug pipeline created the first crack epidemic in the United States, according to Webb. The crack profits were then sent to Honduras to purchase equipment, weapons, and ammunition, which was then given to the Contra forces in Nicaragua. During all this time, the CIA was fully aware that the Contras were finding themselves with drug sales in the United States. In response, the CIA at best closed its eyes and at worst protected the Contras by pressuring other agencies not to investigate Blandon and Menendez. When Congress finally approved a large amount of financial support for the Contras, the federal government finally started prosecuting those involved in the crack trafficking business, as the CIA ceased to provide protection. Webb's accusations would take the United States by storm. Major politicians and millions of people across the United States would demand investigations. Congress, the CIA, and many other federal agencies would perform internal investigations to see if the government was involved in any way. Webb himself would become somewhat of a celebrity for his investigative journalism. Many in the United States had already been suspicious of the clandestine activities of the US government, and many saw these articles as a validation of their suspicions. Even the infamous Alex Jones would allege that he personally had been in contact with Webb, and apparently was going to work with him to further expose the government.
And while I was watching the movie, I remembered the last conversation I ever had with Webb. I kept saying, yeah, I'll put the website up. Yeah, I'll help you. And he called up and he said, man, they're destroying my life. I've got all the documents to prove it now. I've got this book coming out to vindicate myself. And you said you'd help me. And I'll even help you. I'll even pay you after I'm able to sell the book. They've taken everything I got. What the hell's your problem? Jones, you told me you'd help me. Nobody helps me, and slammed the phone down.
However, Webb's reporting would soon come under fire from other major news outlets, such as the New York Times, the LA Times, and the Washington Post. Others would begin to poke holes in Webb's logic, and the house of cards would come tumbling down. Many alleged that Webb had made grand accusations in his articles but came up short in the evidence department. In the next section, I'm going to analyze the claims that Webb made, and the counter-evidence presented by the New York Times, LA Times, and the Washington Post, and other research that I've conducted. After the next section, the context needed to understand Webb and the claims will be complete, and I'll finally be able to share with you all on whether or not I believe that Webb was killed by the CIA. So the CIA wanted to support the Contras in their efforts to overthrow the socialist government of Nicaragua. After all, the Cold War was still raging, and the last thing the United States wanted was another communist stronghold in its backyard. Cuba was more than enough. But overthrowing governments is expensive, and Congress was unwilling to open its purse strings to support the Contras, at least in the early to mid-80s. So the Contras had to get creative. This creativity would be the center of Webb's 3 articles. Webb himself would argue that the Contras, with the blessing and protection of the CIA, started to smuggle cocaine into the United States. They cooked it into crack and essentially kick-started the crack epidemic across America. Additional support was provided by the military of El Salvador, and allegedly an Air Force base in Texas was being used to bring in the cocaine by air. But the big question is whether any of these allegations can be supported by the evidence. This is perhaps the most important piece of context needed for the main question of whether Webb was killed by the CIA. If Webb was telling the truth, it supports the notion that he was a threat to the CIA and needed to be dealt with. But if he was wrong, then the CIA would have far less motivation to kill him, especially on American soil. It is also important to determine whether any of this information was even new, or if it already existed in the public. Again, damning, private, classified information, that would probably get the CIA pissed. But anything else, they would probably let it slide. Or maybe just try other methods of trying to discredit him instead of trying to take his life. So in this section, we'll analyze Webb's claims based on the evidence and see what is true and what is wrong. I will also analyze whether the CIA took any actions against Webb. Now, it is true that both Blandón and Menendez had connections with the former regime in Nicaragua, and they both did flee to the United States. It is also true that they weren't fans of the Sandinista government and wanted it gone. But where the situation becomes tricky is just how deeply the two were involved with the Contras and just how much they contributed to them. Webb implied that they sent millions from the drug profits, but the New York Times article Pivotal Figures of Newspaper Series May Only Be Bit Players by Tim Golden states that the only confirmed financial contribution was when Menendez picked up a restaurant tab of $5,375 on the behalf of the Contras political leader Adolfo Calero. In addition, the article states that Menendez may have sent some weapons to the Contras on one occasion, but the exact amount is unclear. It is important to note that Webb provided no evidence of any kind to support his assertion that millions in drug profits were being sent to the Contras. But besides the money, Menendez's overall involvement in the Contra movement was limited. In San Francisco, the Nicaraguan exiles usually met together above an auto body repair shop. The shop was owned by Edward Navarro, who organized the group. He would tell the New York Times that Menendez showed up from time to time for the meetings, but usually stood quietly in the back and didn't really say much. Adolfo Calero would tell the New York Times that he met Menendez 4 times in California in 1984 and 1985, but he denied that Menendez ever held any official position in the Contras. However, he did support Webb's claim that Menendez and Blandón once traveled to Honduras to meet with Bermudez. Furthermore, a former Nicaraguan official who had investigated Menendez stated that the Sandinista-controlled Nicaraguan police never found any evidence to support the claim that Menendez used cocaine profits to support the Contras. Again, it wouldn't really make sense for the Sandinistas to lie about this, considering that they had no incentive to protect Menendez. Instead, they actually had an incentive to make the Contras and the CIA look bad, as they were the opponents of the Sandinistas. In the LA Times article examining charges of CIA role in crack sales by Daniel McManus and other contributors, it was reported that Menendez and Blandón, according to 2 sources close to them, never contributed more than $50,000 in support to the Contras. Also, another thing that is interesting is that the timeline doesn't really support what Webb alleges. For example, Blandón and Menendez only worked together for about a year according to the LA Times. By late 1982, Blandón was already moving towards other cocaine suppliers, and by 1983, he had completely separated from Menendez. This is important because Blandón starts selling cocaine to Ricky Ross in 1983. Meaning that once Ross enters the picture, Menendez is already gone. This contradicts what Webb was saying. According to Webb, Menendez was bringing in hundreds of kilos of cocaine from Blandón in 1983 and 1984. In addition, according to the New York Times, Blandón himself stated that he had stopped supporting the Contras in 1983. The LA Times reported that Blandón admitted to selling cocaine in 1982 on behalf of Menendez, but had decided to stop later that same year, as the Contras were receiving money from the US government. Blandón at that point would begin pocketing the money for himself. Blandón would, however, admit to sending a few $1,000s, some supplies, and a pickup truck to the Contras per the New York Times. Again, in 1983 is when Rick Ross enters the picture and supposedly helps kickstart the crack epidemic. According to the New York and the LA Times, by 1983, Menendez and the Contras were pretty much out of the picture. Blandon had instead established direct connections with the Colombian cartels and no longer needed Menendez. Therefore, even if Blandon and Rick Ross did start the crack epidemic, it wasn't done with Menendez, or the Contras, or the CIA. Also, Webb himself in his article mentioned that Menendez openly denied that he was sending profits to the Contras. Webb didn't really offer any other evidence or testimony to show that Menendez was lying. Honestly, a lot of Webb's reporting was either without evidence or it kind of stretched the facts. So the bottom line is that there is just no evidence that Blandon or Menendez ever sent anything to the Contras that came close to the millions of dollars that Webb claimed. It was at most $50,000 per sources close to them, as cited by the LA Times. According to a CNN article, Contra leaders say CIA not involved in drug sales by Carl Rochelle, Adolfo Calero denied that he ever took a penny from Menendez, but another Contra leader named Eden Pastora stated that he took money from Menendez on 2 occasions. Again, Menendez and Blandon did send money, but it was of low value and only happened a few times. Don Garcia, the Mercury News editor who helped with the Dark Alliance series, would state that the claim that Menendez and Blandon sent millions of dollars to the Contras was simply based on the volume of cocaine sold, and the statement by Blandon that they sent the proceeds from their sales to the Contras. But again, Blandon also testified that he sent nothing after 1983, so if he was sending any profits, it would have been before 1982, before the operation even got really started. Furthermore, Webb himself admitted that he wasn't sure just how much money found its way back into the CIA's army in the Dark Alliance series themselves. Now, Webb was correct about Blandon being let off easy and becoming an informant for the DEA.
Blandon, and this came out in court. I mean, Danilo Blandon is now a government witness. He works for the Drug Enforcement Administration, and we've paid him, I don't know, $166,000 over the last 18 months because he's such a good informant.
The LA Times agrees with Webb that Blandon was paid $166,000 to provide information to the DEA to help with investigations and convictions against other drug traffickers. The government considered him important in their war against drugs. Now, to tell you the truth, I'm not sure why Menendez himself was never arrested and convicted like Blandon and Rick Ross were. That part of the story is still a mystery to me, but I wasn't really able to find any collusion between him and the government. In the CNN article, Justice Report finds no CIA link to crack cocaine trafficking by Terry Frieden. Inspector General Michael Browich stated that all drug traffickers involved in supplying Los Angeles were investigated, but these investigations weren't always successful. However, he reported that there was no evidence that these investigations were ever obstructed by the CIA or other federal agencies. Speaking of the government, it is certainly true that the CIA was aware that members of the Contras were using the drug trade to fund themselves. Per the New York Times article resurrecting a disgraced reporter by David Carr, Frederick Hitz, the CIA Inspector General, testified before a House Intelligence Committee in 1998 and stated that the CIA knowingly maintained relationships with members of the Contras who were alleged to have been involved in the drug trade.
There are instances where CIA did not, in an expeditious or consistent fashion, cut off relationships with individuals supporting the Contra program who were alleged to have engaged in drug trafficking activity or take action to resolve the allegations.
Furthermore, in the CNN article, CIA admits it overlooked Contra's links to drugs by Jonathan Eichen. An internal report from the CIA had been released, in which it was found that the CIA overlooked or ignored reports that the Contras were funding themselves by selling drugs in the United States. The report also revealed that the CIA was working with a Honduran businessman named Alan Hyde to provide logistical support to the Contras. Hyde had previously been reported in a Defense Department report in 1984 as being involved in the drug trade. The report also revealed that the CIA dissuaded other federal agencies from investigating Contra groups and their associates. The article mentions that in one instance, the CIA discouraged the DEA from investigating Oliver North and his efforts to bypass legal restrictions to support the Contras. This report contradicts what was being said by the Justice Department. In addition, per the Intercept article titled How the CIA Watched Over the Destruction of Gary Webb by Ryan Devereaux, there had been a congressional subcommittee in 1989 led by Senator John Kerry, which had uncovered considerable evidence in his 1,166-page report of the Contras being linked to drug and gun running, and the US government was fully aware of it. Therefore, I believe it is fair to say that the CIA knew about the Contras and their involvement in selling drugs in the United States and did nothing to stop them, and in some cases tried to protect them from legal prosecution. So Webb was certainly correct in saying that the CIA was aware of the Contras drug trade and provided them with some cover. However, neither of these revelations connects the CIA to Menendez or Blandon. In fact, per the LA Times article examining charges of the CIA role in crack sales by Doyle McManus, the LA Times stated that Mercury News had presented no direct evidence that the CIA interfered on behalf of Menendez or Blandon, and other former law enforcement officials contacted by the LA Times denied these claims. Per a New York Times article resurrecting a disgrace reported by David Carr, Jerry Kepos, the executive editor at Mercury News, revealed in 1997 that they didn't feel like they had found any hard proof that the top CIA officials knew of the relationship between Menendez and Blandon and other members of the Contras who worked with the CIA, such as Bermudez and Adolfo Calero. In addition, Kepos admitted that the series erroneously implied that the connection between Ross and Menendez and Blandon was behind the crack epidemic in the United States. So let's get into whether these three characters of a story really did cause the epidemic. So it seems to me that Webb was correct that the CIA was somehow involved in all this, but he might have gotten some of the characters wrong. So let's get into whether the three characters of our story really did cause the epidemic. The LA Times article, Tracking the Genesis of the Crack Trade by Jesse Katz, quoted Kepos saying that he acknowledged that he was unsure whether Ross and his Nicaraguan contacts were the first to bring cocaine into Los Angeles' black neighborhoods. In 1976, another man of similar complexion named Thomas Reese had been introduced to crack almost 7 years before Ross was in the market. Reese had been arrested on cocaine-related charges in 1972, 1977, and 1980. Reese, with a friend in the Bay Area, had started to produce his own crack and started to deal in South Central Los Angeles, the same place where Rick Ross would get his start. The claim by Webb that cocaine was virtually unobtainable in black neighborhoods until Ross and the Nicaraguans got involved just isn't backed up by the facts. Reese was eventually convicted and imprisoned in 1984, around the time that Ross had gotten established, and was the best known trafficker in the area, especially in the black communities of Los Angeles. Another major dealer that was active during the time of Ross was Brian Bennett. He was also another South Central Los Angeles dealer who operated in black neighborhoods. From 1986 to 1988, Bennett was selling more than a ton, or 907 kilograms of crack a week. Bennett worked directly with a member of the Colombian Cali cartel named Mario Ernesto Villabano. According to the LAPD Deputy Chief Glenn Levant, this was the most significant relationship of any dealer and supplier in the Los Angeles area. There was no Nicaraguan connection in this situation. Let me give you a few more examples of just how large the cocaine and crack industry was in the Los Angeles area. In 1981, 51 kilograms of cocaine were seized in a warehouse in Van Nuys. The cocaine had been owned by a Colombian drug ring that had handled 1,632 kilograms of cocaine in just 7 months. In 1982, the automaker John DeLorean, yes, he's the guy who created the DeLorean that was featured in the Back to the Future movies, was indicted for conspiring to import almost 100 kilograms of cocaine into the United States. In comparison, in 1983, Blandon claimed that he was selling about 50 kilograms of cocaine to Rick Ross. The point that I'm trying to make here is that Rick Ross was a big fish, but he was operating in an ocean where he had a very little overall impact. There were major dealers before and after him. Ross and his Nicaraguan contacts were not the main importers and did not introduce cocaine or crack to anybody. The drug was already here and it was well established. So here's the bottom line based on my own research and analysis. The CIA, while trading and providing logistical support to the Contras, was fully aware that its members were selling drugs in the United States to fund themselves. The CIA at best ignored these revelations, and at worst was providing cover for them by pressuring other agencies such as the DEA to halt their investigations. And of course, the CIA did nothing to protect the United States from the importation of these drugs, even when they were aware of it, and probably could have stopped it. However, there is no strong evidence that Blandon or Menendez were aligned with the CIA, and by using Ross were responsible for kickstarting the crack epidemic in the United States. Both cocaine and crack were already well established before Ross, or the Nicaraguans even entered the picture. There is also no evidence that Blandon or Menendez gave millions of dollars to the Contras. Neither Webb nor anybody else has been able to provide evidence. Also, according to the words of Blandon himself and others, Blandon and Menendez had cut ties with one another by early 1983 at the latest. Therefore, the trifecta of Blandon, Menendez, and Rick Ross, which Webb alleged founded and dominated the crack trade in Los Angeles, just couldn't have existed based on the timeline available. However, Blandon and Menendez did send a maximum of $50,000 in total support in the form of cash or weapons. It is also true that Blandon and Menendez met with Bermudez at least once. He himself was in charge of the largest Contra group and received financial support from the CIA, but there doesn't really seem to be any evidence that Blandon and Menendez agreed to sell drugs for him, and there doesn't seem to be any evidence that these meetings ever happened again. There is evidence that Menendez met with Adolfo Calero, who was a political officer for the Contras and linked with the CIA, but again there's no evidence that Blandon or Menendez worked for him directly or gave him large sums of money for the Contra war effort. There is also no evidence that Blandon or Menendez directly worked with the CIA either. At the end of the day, I believe that Blandon, Menendez, and Rick Ross were doing business largely for themselves, with next to no connections with the CIA. Also, I don't believe that the CIA purposely introduced crack into the United States to support the Contras either. Again, crack was already in America in the early to mid 1970s. This was before Nicaragua fell to the socialists in 1979, and the Contras conflict even began. Again, the timelines just don't support the assertions made by Webb. But the CIA certainly does deserve criticism for not helping to stop the flow of drugs into the United States and knowingly working with groups that had ties to the drug trade. The overall idea that the CIA was being complicit in the drug trade is certainly true. So you could say that one of Webb's core arguments was true. However, Webb somewhat ruined his reporting by adding in other sensational details that he couldn't substantiate. Webb was also correct in linking Rick Ross to Nicaraguan drug traffickers who had some relationships with the Contras and the CIA, but again, these relationships were limited, and there is no evidence that Blandon or Menendez were ever directly working or taking orders from the Contras or the CIA. Well, I hope you enjoyed all that analysis. In the next section, we'll explore what happened to Webb after the story, and whether the CIA could have played any role in his death. In my opinion, of course, because unfortunately, there's no smoking gun to give us a definite answer. We have to use the available information and make our own assumptions. Did the CIA kill Webb? So, at this point I've talked a lot. We've extensively covered Webb's allegations in his 3-part Dark Alliance series and the counterarguments posted by the New York Times, LA Times, CNN, and other sources that I've looked at. All this context was important to establish so that you, as the viewer, can come to your own conclusions. At the end of the day, I don't just want you to take my word for it. I want you to look into the relevant information and make your own well-informed opinions and sound decisions. I'll be posting a link to the articles that I used in the description. Now, after this article was published, Webb initially received a lot of support from both politicians like Maxine Waters and members of the African American community who already distrusted the federal government due to historical injustices. But by late 1996 and early 1997, the tides were changing, and other newspapers started to poke holes in Webb's story. This criticism would lead to the executive editor of the Mercury News, Jerome Kepos, on May 11, 1997, to publish a response. He defended the notion that the individuals mentioned in the article did have connections with the Contras, but that the series did not meet their own standards. Kepos conceded the Dark Alliance series only published one interpretation of the evidence, and did not include any details that contradicted Webb's main argument. Kepos also admitted that the amount of money that Blandon and Menendez were making was estimated, but was presented as a fact. He also admitted that the series also simplified how the crack epidemic came about, and created impressions that were open to misinterpretation. The LA Times article tracking the genesis of the crack trade by Jesse Katz quotes Kepos as saying that he's unsure whether Ross and his Nicaraguan suppliers were the first to bring cocaine to Los Angeles, or that they were the pivotal force behind the crack epidemic in the United States. Now, Webb was understandably not happy about this response and the lack of support from his own paper. He would resign in November of 1997 and go on to write a book also titled Dark Alliance, where he expanded on his original points and arguments. Webb would, for a time, work for the California Register and join the Sacramento News and Review in August of 2004, but his reputation and fame would never return. Webb, who had at one point become a household name and won multiple awards, was now nothing. The world that chewed him up and tossed him away. His taking of his own life by shooting himself twice in the head was seen by many as suspicious. It isn't really a common way to go, but the coroner would report that it was unusual but not unprecedented. Regardless, many have believed that because of his previous accusations against the CIA, the government was behind his demise. Of course, we can all agree that the CIA wouldn't exactly be above killing someone that they viewed as a major threat. I mean, we're talking about an agency that overthrew governments, operated black sites, and tried to literally mind control people through projects such as MKUltra. Now, here's what we know about the CIA and his dealings with Webb. An article in The Intercept by Ryan Devereaux, published on September 25, 2014, recounts how the largest newspapers helped the CIA contain Webb's reporting. On September 18, 2014, the CIA released a large number of documents in which they highlighted their response to Webb. Originally, the CIA was alarmed by the accusations and considered it a PR disaster, but was soon relieved when major American newspapers such as the New York Times and the LA Times decided to play defense for the CIA without any request directly from the CIA itself. In fact, the CIA collaborated where it could with the newspapers and other media agencies that wanted to debunk Webb, and noted that he used previously established relationships with many papers to discredit Webb. In fact, according to The Intercept, the CIA had successfully discouraged one major news affiliate from covering the story. The names of this news affiliate is not provided, so the CIA certainly worked to utilize its journalistic connections to discredit Webb, but it appears that major newspapers such as the New York Times, LA Times, and the Washington Post did a lot of the work on their own, allowing the CIA to keep its hands mostly clean. The Intercept also notes that other newspapers spent all their effort discrediting Webb instead of trying to explore the ties between the Contras, drug trafficking, and the CIA. So the CIA was definitely trying to fight against Webb, but they were pretty satisfied because they didn't really have to do anything. The media decided to do it for them, and with Webb completely discredited, he wasn't really much of a threat to the CIA either. Now another thing is that the timing of it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. Webb died at the end of 2004, but his articles had been published in the summer of 1996, 8 years before his death. Why would the CIA after all this time decide to act against him? Remember, by 2004, Webb was a discredited nobody. He wasn't taken seriously anymore and didn't really have any reach. He was mostly listened to in conspiracy circles like those of Alex Jones. Webb had no mainstream influence, and thereby wasn't really a threat to the CIA anymore, if he ever was in the first place. Again, a lot of the accusations that Webb made against the CIA weren't true, at least when it came to their connections with Rick Ross, Blandon, and Menendez, and also the implications that they themselves were directly responsible for the crack epidemic. The lack of evidence that Webb presented doesn't really make him a threat to the CIA, and if he were a threat, he would certainly have been dealt with earlier. Again, I couldn't find any evidence that the CIA went after him directly, but instead, they supported journalists who had decided to attack him of their own accord. Some would call these attacks overboard. For example, the LA Times writer that I mentioned by the name of Jesse Katz would say in a 2013 radio interview that what they did was overkill. For some reason, major newspapers really wanted to bury the story. But again, I can't really find any evidence that this was coordinated by the CIA. Again, it appears that the CIA caught a break and decided to go along with it and provide help where they could. But the main takedown of Webb was, well, organic in a way. Now, Gary Webb also carried other demons that could have contributed to his demise. According to a SACB article by Sam Staden, Webb's ex-wife, Susan Bell, had told reporters that Webb had been depressed for some time because he couldn't find a journalist job at a major newspaper. Webb had also in 2004 made Susan the beneficiary of his bank account and had sold his house the week before his death. I think this is the most reasonable explanation of why he died. He was depressed. His career had been destroyed and he had nothing left to live for. He loved being a journalist and hunting for the truth, but now he felt abandoned and betrayed and unable to do anything. So it might make just as much sense to say that the New York Times or the LA Times killed him as the CIA did. Perhaps you could claim that the CIA and the American news media indirectly killed him, but this is as far as you can go with the available evidence. So my final answer will be that he was not killed by the CIA. Webb had not really presented any new evidence to link the CIA to the crack epidemic, and thereby he didn't really pose any sort of a threat to the agency. He was right that the agency was aware of it and did nothing to stop the drug trafficking coming into the United States. But this information had already been released before his article in 1989 per a congressional subcommittee headed by John Kerry. Again, not exactly new damning information that the CIA would need to treat as an existential threat. Also, he died 8 years after publishing the articles when he was basically a nobody, and therefore he wasn't really a threat to anybody, and murdering him wouldn't really make any sense. The CIA appeared pretty content with the takedown that he received from mainstream news, and no longer considered his reporting to be a threat. His family and friends reported that he was depressed because of what had happened to him, and people do take their lives because of things like that all the time. So I don't believe that the CIA killed Gary Webb. I believe that he got a little carried away and honestly wanted to uncover a conspiracy, and he believed that what he was doing was the right thing, but he didn't really check his sources, and in some cases didn't present any solid evidence. It's honestly a tragic tale overall, but that is my final assessment. Conclusion. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. This was a long video and a long time in the making. I'd actually started researching this video back in May of 2023, but put it on the back burner for a while. I decided to pick it back up this summer and finally cover the story. I think this might be the longest video in almost 2 years. Don't quote me on that because I might be wrong. Anyways, let me know what you think in the comments below. Other than that, I hope you have a great day. And since this will most likely release in mid-October, have a great Halloween. I guess this is kind of a Halloween episode because it is creepy. I always love anything to do with conspiracy and the CIA, and I really liked researching and making this video. Anyhow, I bid you farewell.